start with question one?
No. You can keep talking. I just figure I might catch some good stuff. Sometimes I catch good stuff before the actual questions start.
Oh, okay.
So you were mentioning
How the events of
Mhm.
last year,
Mhm.
George Floyd, the marches, the rebellions in the street, etc., are nothing new. Um, they may differ in degree and kind, but there's a long historical strain of activism among African Americans. You could say it began in Africa with those resisting
Mhm.
enslavement on the ships, those who jumped off, so much in bodies being thrown over because they died that schools of sharks follow the ships. And when getting here, people deliberately taking their own lives, some of them. And so there's this mythology that evolved out of those instances of that kind of resistance, such as the people could fly, which are originally thought to be based on Igbo experiences that from those who were taken saw what was awaiting them and their future progeny and decided it was absolutely untenable, and they decided to walk back into the ocean to return home. Or there's another variant of that where people are working in the fields and a signal is given, usually a song, and they all lift up and fly away. So that's the history, the beginnings of some of those early points that needs to be shared and discussed. I know currently there's a feeling among some of the younger creatives, among their editors as well, a few of their editors also, that there's been too much of that history. I would argue, in fact, there hasn't been enough of that history. And given the current political status of the United States, we will never get that history in many schools across the country, given the opposition to it. So for me, we have to talk about the nations in Africa before enslavement and during enslavement. And we also have to talk about that Arabic slave trade that occurred also. And we don't talk about that very much. We also have to talk about the cultures and how they differed. So it's just not one African culture or African people. There are African cultures and African peoples even today. And so we don't do that. So for me, I would start with the history before encounters with Europeans. Lay that foundation and then move on to what happened when there were encounters occurring, be they Arabic or be they European. And then I would talk about what that meant, and I'm not being disrespectful to people of Jewish descent by saying this, our African Holocaust, the Middle Passage, when millions and millions of Africans perished in that transatlantic slave trade. And we have to remember, when we talk about that transatlantic slave trade, it was involving Europe, the United States, South America, and the islands in the Caribbean. So it was a world phenomenon. Slavery has always been a world phenomenon. We need to talk about that. One of the best ways to talk about it, I think, depending upon the age of a child, would be the late Tom Billings' book, White Ships, Black Cargo, The Middle Passage. And it's nearly wordless, and it's just these magnificent illustrations. And when you look at the ship, it's comprised of black bodies, African bodies, and how they were placed in the ships, but it's their bodies. And the mast, not the mast, but the front of the ship is the face of an African. It's very stunning and riveting, and that's the kind of book that has to be shared in pieces with an adult guiding the interactions with the text, particularly with kids, third or fourth grade. I think younger kids need something a little bit different. Then I would use The Door of No Return. many people of African descent have returned to the Sengambia to go to that last spot where Africans were sent to the U.S., Europe, and Central and South America and the Caribbean. And I've had friends who've gone there, and they talk about how devastating it feels to be in there, and they get a visceral feeling of what some have characterized as the spirit of the ancestors by going to that. And Stephen Barboza is a photographer. I think he's still in New York City. I'm not sure. But he has a book, a picture book, that's stunning, The Door of No Return. And I think we could share that, and perhaps requesting that would bring it back in print for children. And then there are the stories of Virginia Hamilton that I think, in her novels and her folktales, that form the basis for a grand narrative, a master narrative about who we were prior to enslavement. And it's the magical adventures of Pretty Pearl. And for those futurists who talk about, wow, we don't have sci-fi or speculative fiction or futurism, they're absolutely wrong. You know, it's antecedents. I would argue, go back to Charles Chestnut in the 1800s. And then it goes on, and there are people like Samuel Delany and some others as well. So, but there is a children's aspect to that also in the folk literature, because quite a bit of folk literature underlies fantasy, whether it's Celtic, Irish, Russian, French. Some of that underlies it, but The Magical Adventures of Pretty Pearl is a novel, and Pearl is one of the gods, the great three gods. So Pearl is the little sister, and then there's John Henry, the middle child, and then there's High John the Conqueror, the oldest god and the most powerful god. And Pretty Pearl is sitting on Mount Kenya, so you see the connections, how it places it in Africa. And she wants to know what is going on in that place called America, and why are those people treated that way. And so she keeps pestering her brothers, and finally she goes down, and she experiences everything that they begin to experience. And it becomes extraordinarily fascinating for her, but also it's life-changing for a god, for her to experience that. And what Virginia Hamilton does masterfully as well is that she blends in American Indian culture and people into her novel and in Pretty Pearl. So you begin to see the interconnections there, and it's powerful because it's from the perspective of a child. Although she's a god, she's given up her godness. So it has echoes of Jesus to some extent to me, if you want to think of it in that way, who gives up their divinity and comes to earth and then experiences what's on earth. But she has a whole set of novels and picture books that talk about that. And one of the most pivotal, I think, and it's not read very much, is the Anthony Burns. And it's a tale about someone who's enslaved, who experiences freedom, and who's hunted, and all the experiences that he goes through. So it's stunning in terms of the language, the plot, the imagery that's created by her words, the tone that's set, and you begin to understand the sense of malaise, of melancholy that could have permeated and did and could have remained instantiated permanently. But there is a spirit that he has that comes through, even though his case is not decided the way he would like it to be. And then she has her biographies. She has one of W.B. Du Bois, whom I think might be a distant relative of hers. I know Du Bois is related, Du Bois's wife. No, she may be related to Du Bois's wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, because they all came out of Yellow Springs, Ohio. And so Shirley Graham wrote biographies in the 40s and 50s and 60s for children too. And Virginia Hamilton is also related to Lorenzo Graham, her brother. The whole Graham family seems to be artistically inclined, and so does Virginia Hamilton's family for generations. They're all in Yellowstone, or were near the Yellow Springs area. And so Virginia's biography of Du Bois is extraordinary. It's probably out of print. But she also did one that has the best title, Paul Robeson, The Life and Times of a Free Black Man. And we know what happened to Paul Robeson when he challenged existing social, political, economic conditions. But he still engaged in that battle despite losing his popularity, suffering, and not being able to perform his art in certain places. And she wrote that for children. And that's extraordinary. So where are those kind of biographies? Carol Weatherford Boston is one of those persons who writes those kinds of biography, and we need to know her. So we can't put this history aside. We just simply can't, because if we don't know our history, what are we? The people who are rudderless, and we have to pass that history on. And so we need to have both the remembered, the known, and what's envisioned, which comes from Virginia Hamilton, that we recall the past, we live and exist in the known, but we also think about the imagined, the future. So hence that futurism that people always want to talk about. Read Virginia Hamilton's essay on the same topic. Her husband, Arnold Adolph, the late, well, he just died this year also. He collected her writings and speeches in a wonderful volume, and I think that should be sort of a Bible for writers and artists and musicians and so forth, because there's so much in there.
So I think like there were a couple of things that resonated with me. So that's why I turned on the record early. It's on this idea of, this is what I heard, right? This idea of even back during enslavement times, or even before this, like some of the spirituals, right? I'm thinking in some ways those spirituals, I feel it's sort of speculative.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's this longing for when the spirit world and this connection with ancestors, but also what's the next, the beyond.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought about that.
And see, there's another essay that people should read when they think about that. Du Bois's essay in The Souls of Black Folk on sorrow songs. That essay itself will make me cry because he talks about how those songs embody the experiences, the past, and the hope for the future. So here again, that thread is always running through. It's not referred to in terms of today, but the idea or the ideas have been there.
So you've already answered one of my questions, I think, about
Virginia Hamilton's role?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think for me, like what resonated in, doing the research and preparation for this interview was this idea of her referring of her work as liberation literature.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what that means to you.
She does, because it's liberatory in the sense that it's from the people. It's about the people. It's told in their, at least as she interprets their voices, their languages, their hopes, their desires, their experiences, and so forth. But it's liberatory in the sense that you have to have it, and that you can't escape from your current conditions because they're stratified and you aren't fully realized in the society as it's currently constituted. And you have to engage and work to ensure that you become free, intellectually, aesthetically, politically, economically, and so forth. And I would argue for her, that goes along with preserving elements of culture. Virginia was a singer as well. And there's a wonderful story about how she met her husband, Arnold Adolph, in New York, because she left Yellow Springs and Antioch College and moved to New York to try her hand at acting and singing. But she has always been a part of the music. She and her husband, jazz, which is considered one of the few musical forms created in America. Some people say the only, but I think you have to consider country music in some ways too. But then that's debatable. But so it's always the music. Her father was a musician. He played the mandolin. She learned to play it and other things. Her family had a rich tradition of telling stories. When she gives her speech for the Newbery Medal, when she's the first person of African descent to win the Newbery Medal, Arnold Bontemps had an honor medal in the 1950s for his history of the Negro. I think was the title of it. But Hamilton preserves those folktales, preserves that language, captures those histories, tells those stories from history and from current times in the future. And so she herself argues that those books that I referenced earlier, The Life and Times of Paul Bunyan, A Free Black Man, W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography, the literature of folktales about flying away, her story, which is her picture book collection of tales about women of African descent. And it's a really beautiful cover. Leo and Diane Dillon completed the illustrations. And it's women of all colors. So there's a gradation of women of African descent of all colors, from the whitest to the blackest. And it's stunning, and the illustrations throughout. And so there are these folk stories about those women. So that's a part of it. And then the book, The House of Dyes Dreers, has an element of that, because she talks about it's set within a home that was a part of the Underground Railroad. So this literature is conveying that history, and it becomes a part of that literature for liberation, but also for aesthetic pleasure. And I think that's what a lot of people miss who write for children. They forget to entertain children because they always want to teach a lesson. But Hamilton and several others are able to bring forth that history without being overly didactic in doing so.
Because I think that's come up as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some instances, I think that's where hopefully like the speculative fiction
Mm-hmm.
provides sort of an offshoot of that idea
Mm-hmm.
of being didactic, because it's
Mm-hmm.
sort of like, it's interesting to kind of teach a future that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
It's more, it allows the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to speak with Dr. Thomas a little bit about
Mm-hmm.
that, because I love her idea of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And
remember Virginia Hamilton's essay,
okay.
the known, the remembered, and the imagined.
Yes.
I think that we always have to reference back to that, so that people know that there was that history of this in the literature. And her Justice trilogy is one of the first examples of speculative fiction for youth who are of African descent that's published.
Because I think for me, right, this,
Mm-hmm.
again, what's resonating, I think this call for justice, right,
Mm-hmm.
is an imagining, right? It's an
Mhm.
imagining of a different way of doing things,
Mhm.
a different, thinking differently, planning differently.
Yes.
And how, I think from my reading, right,
Mhm.
a lot of the books, I think they've lost some imagination in a
Mhm.
way, right?
Yeah.
Because either it's steeped in trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and kids come out
Mm-hmm.
eventually of their trauma, but they still are they're just coping with the trauma,
Mhm.
right? And still trying to be normal kids, but there's no opportunity for them to think about, okay,
Mm-hmm.
what can I do next? What can I be next?
Mm-hmm.
And so I love the fact that there's literature that does that,
Mm-hmm.
or that, we can start to reframe the conversations about the possibility
Yeah.
of, just literature in general,
Mhm.
but especially for Black children, because I think
Mm-hmm.
now more than ever,
Mhm.
I think we need to bring back the imagination, or
Yeah.
reclaim it, right?
Yeah. And it could be done in different ways. For example, Virginia, Mildred Taylor, in the sequel to Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, she brings that trauma front and center when JT starts engaging and interacting with the owners, with the white plantation sons. And he's like a little pet to them, as you would have a little monkey. You know, he thinks that they have brought him into their lives as an equal. But he's about to get lynched by them. And so the way in which Cassie's family deals with that is I think is a good example of what has to be done. And in Taylor's whole series of books about her, based on her family, it's directly provided because it is an aspect of life. And what people don't think about when they're, excuse me for a moment, my eyes are watering. What people don't think about is that you can't hide it because children experience it. You know, children were lynched as well, along with adults. Children were sold into slavery. I put my eye drops in already and they still are leaking. Children experience it also. I know Julius Lester can be problematic for some people, but he wrote some extraordinary novels also about slavery. His first two books, other than Look Out Whitey, White Power's Gonna Get Your Mother, which I think might have been one of his firsts, is two books based on slave narratives that were in the WPA. I'm blanking on the titles of both. This Thing Called Love, I think, was one, Love Stories in Slavery. And then another, what was that first one that won the Newbery Honor? Can't think of the title, I'll have to look it up. But anyway, to me, his magnus opus was The Day of Tears. And to me, I cry every time I read that book. It's a spare, short, elegant book, but it perfectly captures what it feels like to see your child sold off in slavery. And it's a literary exploration of the day of the largest slave sale in America on one of the plantations. Can't remember if it's Georgia or one of the other states. Anyway, the family works in the house. So in many ways, they become comfortable and think that they will be unaffected by what other enslaved people are affected by until the owner of the plantation needs money because of his lifestyle and gambling, and he sells their daughter off. And it's just extraordinary. And it's the kind of book I think that could be shared to show what that was like, because it's a reality. Look at how many children are being shot in Chicago in drive-bys. You're gonna say, well, you can't talk about that? And there are books that will depict those kinds of things. One of my absolute favorites is the autobiography of my dead brother, because Walter Dean Byers has these stunning books focused on black males, and he was inspired to write them because the males, he would go into detention centers and juvenile prisons for writing with youth, and he was struck by how many of them were there and who wanted to write and who felt that no one saw them. And so he started writing their stories and encouraging them to write their stories and so on. So he has about 10 novels that focus on males, starting with, well, he's more than 10 if you start with his works from the late 60s, early 70s, such as Fast Sam, Cool Clyde and stuff. I might have it mixed up. But Monster was groundbreaking in literature for youth, relative to format, style, writing, characterization, everything. The cover has a black male with his prison number under underneath him. He's being photographed for his mugshot. It's written as a script, and he says, the main character says he writes it that way because he's been called a monster by the prosecuting attorney. He wants them to know, everybody to know who he is, and it has an ending that's provocative. He has Dope Sick, about young people getting into heroin, which is still relevant today. One of his best that I absolutely love because it just touches my heart so much is Somewhere in Darkness, because so many of our brothers, fathers, uncles, cousins, husbands, etc. are incarcerated. And this focuses on a boy in Chicago whose father is incarcerated, but his father is sick and has to be taken to the hospital. He's escorted by armed guards, but he escapes from the hospital.